The winter of 1944 pressed against Warsaw with a cruelty that felt personal, as though the season itself had allied with the invaders. The snow covered everything, the ruins, the bodies, even the burned out tram lines, so that the city looked like a graveyard dressed in white. Yet beneath the surface, the streets steamed faintly, carrying the stench of burned wood, twisted iron, and blood that never seemed to wash away. Elena Kosalska walked with careful steps, her boots crunching softly in the icy rubble. She was only 26. The war had carved the years across her face as surely as any sculptor. Her blonde hair, once carefully pinned, now stuck in uneven strands from beneath a faded scarf. Her hands, which had once been steady and gentle with patients in crisp hospital rooms, now shook from exhaustion. She carried not syringes or clean linens, but scraps of bread, pieces of cloth torn from corpses, and a single syringe of morphine she guarded like treasure. St. Mary's Hospital, where she had trained, was now a collapsed ruin. Months earlier, she had watched bombs rip through its red brick walls. The wards that had echoed with moans and the faint ringing of bells were now just heaps of dust and twisted iron. A few nurses had fled, some had been shot, and the rest, she never found out. Elena never allowed herself to imagine their faces too clearly. She was no longer a nurse, at least not officially. No German authorities issued her permission. No Red Cross organization sanctioned her aid, and yet she worked. She cleaned wounds in the basements where civilians huddled together. She bound fractured bones with strips of curtain. She sang lullabies to orphans who refused to cry anymore. In those moments, she still felt like herself, a fragment of the healer she had once been. But everything changed that morning. The sound of boots had woken her before dawn, harsh, rhythmic, confident. German soldiers swept into the street outside the half-collapsed apartment where she had been searching for a colleague. Elena had pressed herself against the brick, her heart hammering, and peered through a jagged hole. What she saw froze her blood. A dozen civilians, men, women, children, were dragged into the street, their faces pale with fear. Some clutched one another's hands. Others stared into the ground. A boy, barely 12, lifted his chin as though trying to appear brave. His mother squeezed his shoulder. One of the soldiers laughed a harsh barking sound and mocked them in German. Another lit a cigarette, the orange glow reflecting against the steel of his helmet. Then casually, without a flicker of hesitation, the first soldier raised his pistol and pressed it against the boy's head. The shot cracked like thunder. The boy fell. His mother screamed, but it was cut short by another shot. Another body hitting the snow. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, stifling her cry. Her eyes filled with tears so hot they burned against the icy air. She wanted to run forward, to shield them, to scream, to do anything, but her body refused. She was a nurse, not a soldier. Her only weapon was the pounding of her heart. The soldiers laughed. They pushed, the others barked more insults and moved on. The bodies lay in the snow, staining it crimson. Elena slumped back, her entire body trembling. She had seen death before. She had watched old men pass away with whispers of prayer, had held the hands of mothers bleeding out in childbirth. But this was not death by nature. It was murder dressed as spectacle, and something inside her broke. That evening, when she returned to the shelter where survivors gathered, others noticed the change immediately. Her eyes, once kind, even in exhaustion, had turned hard. A woman with gray hair asked softly, "Elena Giaco, what did you see?" Elena didn't answer. She simply sat down in the corner, staring at the flickering flame of a candle stuck in a bottle. but inside, a vow formed. She would never forget the faces of those soldiers, the sneer on the one who pulled the trigger, the cigarette glow reflected in another's eyes, the casual shrug of a third. She would never forget the boy or his mother. If God had abandoned Warsaw, then she would not. Her oath was quiet, spoken only in the prison of her mind, but it was stronger than any scream. I will remember. I will not forgive. I will not forget. The weeks dragged on. She continued her duties, tending to civilians, slipping food to orphans, whispering news to resistance fighters. Yet the vow remained. Each time she washed blood from her hands, she remembered the boy. Each time she wrapped a bandage, she remembered the mother. At times, she hated herself for it. A nurse was meant to heal, not destroy. But the oath was not hers to abandon. It clung to her like a second skin. By January 1945, Soviet tanks rolled into Warsaw. To some, it meant liberation. To Helena, it meant only a shifting of masters. She knew the Nazis would retreat, hide changed names, vanish into civilian life. And she knew then what her purpose would become. Survival was not justice. Mercy was a luxury. One evening, wandering through the burned remains of her hospital, Helena found a cracked mirror beneath the rubble. She lifted it, brushed away dust, and stared. The face staring back was not the Helena she remembered. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed her lips, pressed thin. She looked like a ghost. "You're not a nurse anymore," she whispered to her reflection. "You're something else now." The mirror bore silent witness to her transformation. From that night forward, Helena Kowalska was no longer just a healer. She was the keeper of a vow, the angel of vengeance waiting for her time. The war ended, or at least that was what the headline said. Europe cheered as Nazi banners were torn down and Allied flags fluttered above ruined capitals. But for Helena Kowalska, standing in the shattered skeleton of Warsaw, the word end felt like a cruel joke. The war had not ended. It had simply changed its mask. In the spring of 1945, Helena wandered through the rubble with an empty satchel. Her hands, which had once carried bandages and bread, now gripped scraps of paper lists, names, rumors. She moved like a ghost among the living, listening, asking questions in whispers. Where had the soldiers gone? The ones with the laughing eyes, the cigarettes, the pistols. Some people shrugged. Others claimed to know they vanished with the retreat. One man muttered, headed west, melted into Germany like drops in the ocean. That answer was not enough. Helena's oath still burned inside her. When she closed her eyes, she saw the boy's body collapsing into the snow, heard the mother's scream cut short, smelled the gunpowder. She told herself again and again, survival was not justice. The streets might be free of Nazi patrols now, but their ghosts still walked. And somewhere, the men responsible for that morning were alive, drinking, laughing, starting new lives. It was unbearable. The Soviets wasted no time establishing their control. They plastered posters across crumbling walls, new orders, new rules, new faces of power. Helena worked briefly in a Red Army field hospital, treating wounded soldiers in exchange for food and shelter. But she never forgot the differences between patient and enemy. She saved lives because she had been trained to, but her eyes never softened. She was courteous, efficient, even admired by Soviet officers for her steadiness. Yet when she washed her hands at night, she stared into the basin and whispered, "Not forgiven, not forgotten." It was during those weeks that Helena began collecting. She kept fragments, a stolen badge, a crumpled page from a German officer's journal, the faint memory of an insignia. She gathered stories from refugees. An old man described a soldier with a jagged scar near his lip. A woman remembered one with a crooked nose. She wrote these details in a notebook she carried sewn into the lining of her coat. At first, she felt ashamed. She was a nurse, a caretaker. What business did she have writing lists of men she intended to one day destroy? But the shame didn't last. She remembered the boy, and her hands stopped trembling. The ruins of Warsaw became her training ground. She practiced patience, waiting in bread lines without complaint, learning to keep her expression neutral. She practiced silence, listening to others speak. While she memorized every word, she practiced endurance, walking long distances, even when her shoes fell apart, teaching herself to live with hunger. All of it, she knew, was preparation. By late 1945, Helena left Warsaw. She traveled westwards, following streams of displaced persons, refugees, and prisoners of war being released. Trains carried her through landscapes equally scarred, burned fields, hollow villages, bridges collapsing into rivers. Europe had become one vast graveyard, and yet within the rubble, people were already rebuilding. Cafes reopened, children played among ruins, men courted women in ration lines. The world seemed determined to pretend that horror had not just passed, but Elena could not pretend. Sarm, she found work in Munich in a small clinic run by a doctor who had survived the war by keeping his head down. Elena tended to patients with quiet efficiency. Her German was passable, her Polish accent softened by years of practice, and people assumed she was simply another displaced nurse trying to rebuild her life. She let them believe it. In truth, every day in Munich was part of her hunt. She watched the streets, memorized faces, visited taverns where rumors flowed more freely than beer. She knew the soldiers she sought might have changed names, hidden their pasts, but she also knew arrogance. Men who had once laughed as they killed would not so easily bury that part of themselves. They would drink too much boast to the wrong ears, or carry themselves with the swagger of those who believed they had gotten away with everything. One evening, she overheard two men talking outside the clinic. One mentioned a comrade who had fled Poland and now lived under a false name. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She leaned casually against the doorway, listening. The man's laugh was sharp, grating. She etched the sound into her mind. That night in the room she rented above a bakery, Elena opened her notebook and wrote scar near lip, crooked nose, sharp laugh. The list grew longer. But the shadows were not just external, they lived inside her too. When she treated patients, she often had to steady her breathing. A man's cough could send her back to that morning in Warsaw. A child's cry could become the echo of the boy falling. And when she saw German uniforms still worn by some officials, even after the surrender, her hands itched, trembling between the instinct to heal and the desire to strangle. Sometimes in her nightmares, she saw herself walking into a room filled with her patients and pressing a pistol to their foreheads one by one. She would wake drenched in sweat, clutching the cracked mirror she still carried. She would whisper to her reflection, "Not yet, but soon." By 1946, Elena's reputation in Munich had grown. She was respected, even trusted, but she kept to herself, speaking little of her past. When asked where she came from, she gave vague answers. "The East," she said. "There is nothing left there now." Privately, she spent evenings combing through archives, bribing clerks with bread or cigarettes. She searched for transfer records, rosters lists of units stationed in Warsaw. It was tedious work, often fruitless, but occasionally she found a thread. a surname scribbled in fading ink, an officer's signature. Each discovery was a flame in the darkness. One night in the summer of 1946, she sat by her window, watching rain smear the cobblestones. She opened her notebook and reread every name, every description. Then she closed her eyes and imagined them one by one standing before her. She whispered, "You thought the war ended, but for me, it has just begun." And in that moment, Elena Kowalska knew she was no longer drifting. She was moving with purpose. The shadows of war had followed her into peace, but she would learn to command them. She would find them. She would wait as long as it took. And when the time came, she would deliver the justice that no court, no army, no God had given. The angel of vengeance had stepped out of the ruins and into the new world, and she would not stop until every name in her notebook was crossed out. By 1947, Europe had become a labyrinth of lies. Former soldiers disguised themselves as laborers' officers, reinvented themselves as merchants, and collaborators melted into the tide of refugees. The war's wreckage had given birth to a world where no one asked too many questions because everyone carried something to hide. For Elena Kowalska, this chaos was not an obstacle, it was an opportunity. She realized early that remaining Elena the Polish nurse would not serve her hunt forever. Too many people knew her as a healer, a quiet woman with soft hands, but vengeance demanded something more fluid, something untethered. If she wished to move across borders to infiltrate circles where her quarry might hide, she would need a new skin. So one rain-drenched evening in the dim room above the bakery, she opened her cracked mirror. She stared into her reflection until it blurred. Then she whispered, "Elena Kowalska died in Warsaw." The woman staring back was someone else now. She began with papers. In post-war Munich, documents could be bought, traded, forged with startling ease. There were so many displaced persons, millions wandering the continent, that verifying identities was nearly impossible. Elena befriended a black market clerk, a gaunt man with ink-stained fingers who had once worked for the Reich's bureaucracy. Over cigarettes and favors, he produced a set of papers for her. The name on them, Helena Kruger, a German surname common enough not to draw attention, yet respectable enough to open doors. With these papers, she was no longer a displaced Pole, but a German widow, her husband killed at the front. She practiced her story until it flowed as naturally as truth. When she spoke it aloud, she even believed it herself. Changing her name was not enough. She changed her posture, her clothing, her habits. She wore darker dresses, cut her hair shorter, pinned it in a style more fashionable among German women. She forced herself to soften her Polish accent, spending hours repeating words until her tongue obeyed. She learned to smile when people expected sympathy, to nod when they expressed their own grief. And most importantly, she learned to lie with ease. At the clinic, she continued her work, but patients now called her Frau Kruger. She did not correct them. Outside, she moved through markets and cafes as though she had always belonged. If anyone asked about her family, she simply lowered her eyes and said they were lost in the war. People rarely pried further. Everyone had lost someone. Her new identity gave her access to spaces that had once been closed. She attended church gatherings, social meetings, even dances organized by displaced communities. These were not mere diversions, they were hunting grounds. Soldiers often disguised themselves as civilians, but their mannerisms betrayed them.
The stiff shoulders, the reflexive glances toward exits, the way they smoked as if time were endless. Helena observed them all. One evening at a gathering in a parish hall, she met a man who fit too many descriptions from her notebook. Tall, sharp laugh scar curling near his lip. He introduced himself as Herr Müller, a traveling merchant. He drank heavily, his words growing careless as the night deepened. Elena kept her distance, watching.
When he leaned too close to a woman and muttered something in guttural, Polish mocking cruel, her pulse quickened. The cadence of his voice was the same as the one that had barked orders in Warsaw. She excused herself quietly, but her hands shook all the way home. That night she wrote in her notebook, Mueller confirmed scar. Watch closely. But if she was to act, she could not remain only an observer. She needed tools, connections, a way to slip in and out of places unseen. So Elena, now Helena, began cultivating friendships carefully chosen for utility. There was Ingrid, a seamstress who supplied her with modest yet elegant clothing, useful for blending into higher circles. There was Otto, a mechanic, who once served in the Wehrmacht, now bitter and broke eager to trade stories for bottles of schnapps.
And there was Father Bauer, a weary priest who confessed to her in drunken whispers that he sometimes heard confessions from men who had done things in Poland. Elena listened to them all, never revealing more than she must. Her quiet presence made people trust her. They spoke, she memorized. They laughed, she cataloged. Each scrap became another thread in the web she wove. Her double life grew heavier. By day, she treated patients' children with coughs, workers with broken bones. By night, she studied her notebook, cross-referencing names with rumors, movements, with sightings. The list of men she believed still alive narrowed from dozens to five, 5 names, 5 shadows. She stared at the pages so long that her eyes blurred. But in those moments, she also felt something dangerous stirring inside her. Satisfaction, power. She was no longer the powerless nurse watching helplessly as lives were stolen. She was the hunter now, and they, the wolves of the past, were becoming prey. The first time she tested her new persona, it was almost by accident. She followed Muller, her possible quarry, through the streets one evening, keeping a safe distance. He entered a smoky tavern, greeted by others who seemed to know him. Elena sat 2 tables away, ordering a small beer she barely touched. She listened. The men spoke of business, of trade routes, of shipments moving west. Then one joked about Polish winters and mimed firing a rifle. The table erupted in laughter. Muller's scarred lips curled. Elena's hands clenched so tightly around her glass that it cracked, spilling foam onto the floor. She forced herself to remain calm, to smile apologetically at the barkeep. But inside, she burned. That night, she pressed her cracked mirror to her lips and whispered, "One day I will watch the laughter die in your throat."
Rabelais. Yet vengeance was not so simple. She could not simply strike. She had to be careful, meticulous. Any rash move would expose her and her hunt before it had truly begun. So she began to imagine scenarios. How would a man like Muller disappear? A drunken stumble into the river? A robbery gone wrong? A slow poison undetectable in the chaos of post-war shortages? Each plan she drafted, then discarded. She needed perfection, not improvisation. And so Elena's nights stretched into months. She lived as 2 women, the healer and the hunter, the widow and the avenger. The mask of Helena Kruger became second nature, so natural that sometimes when she caught her reflection in the cracked mirror, she wondered which face was truly hers. By 1948, she was ready. Her notebook no longer felt like a burden. It felt like scripture, and she was both its priestess and executioner.
The world believed the war was over, but for Helena, it was only reaching its true climax. The hunters had become complacent. They thought they were safe, and that was their greatest mistake. Munich, autumn of 1948. The city wore its scars like a patient, refusing to heal buildings hollowed by bombs, facades stained with smoke streets, patched in haste but never restored. To most, these ruins were a reminder of survival and the fragile hope of rebuilding. To Helena Kruger, they were cover-darkened streets where memory and vengeance could meet without witness. For months, she had studied him, this man she called only by the name she knew from whispers Muller. He carried himself like any other Bavarian merchant, drinking in taverns, laughing too loudly, buying bread as though his hands had never held a rifle. But Helena had seen that face before. The scar on his lip was not the kind that came from factory work, but from violence she remembered in her bones. And the stories she had collected confirmed it. Survivors muttered in back alleys, displaced Poles spat his name, and every rumor painted him as a former camp guard, cruel enough to take pleasure in suffering. He would be the first. Helena did not allow herself to move hastily. Revenge was not fire, but ice. It required patience, precision, a quiet waiting until the moment froze perfectly in place. She followed him at a distance for weeks, counting his steps, marking the rhythm of his life. 3 nights each week, he drank until his laughter echoed down the tavern walls, and 3 nights he stumbled alone toward the boarding house near the train tracks. He always cut through the same ruined alley, its collapsed walls and scattered bricks, forming a kind of graveyard where no one lingered. Helena followed silently, her breath, measured her shoes, softened with cloth.
She memorized his stumbles, the way he stopped once to urinate against the rubble, the way his laughter turned to mutters when no one else was there to hear him. While she watched, she prepared. From the clinic she still worked at, Helena stole a vial of morphine enough to send a grown man into silence if administered swiftly. From Otto, the drunken mechanic, she borrowed a rope. He thought she needed it to tie down furniture during moving and asked no questions. And from her past, Helena borrowed the thing no one else could give, the steel of patience sharpened into a blade. She even rehearsed the encounter. Not the violence of violence came easy to memory, but the mask she would wear. In the tavern, she positioned herself near Muller one evening, a glass of beer untouched before her, dressed in the modest black of a widow. Her hair was pinned back, her face pale. She let her eyes lower until she felt his stare.
And when he approached with his swagger and his stink of beer, she tilted her head like a woman unsure. He bought her a drink. He spoke of trade, of hardship, of survival, and she listened with a face she had perfected during the war, the mask of submission, of silence, of someone too broken to resist. She told him her name was Helena Kruger, a widow, her husband lost on the Eastern Front. She let her hands tremble. When she spoke, her voice break like thin glass. Muller, already softened by drink, leaned closer, offered hollow sympathy, even touched her wrist. Helena's stomach twisted, but her face did not betray it. She knew then that he was hooked. The night came without ceremony. It was late, the moon smothered by clouds. The streets darkened as though the city itself had chosen to turn away. Muller staggered out of the tavern, singing to himself, his laughter echoing into the hollow bones of Munich's ruins. Helena followed, her cloak wrapped close, her breath steady. At the mouth of the alley, she stepped forward and let her voice slip through the darkness. Herr Muller, she called softly. He turned, eyes blurred by drink, and then lit with recognition. Ah, Frau Kruger. He slurred, grinning, couldn't stay away, eh? She smiled faintly, her voice thin as a thread. I thought you might walk me home. It is so very dark tonight. His grin widened and he staggered closer. Of course, of course. He never saw the cloth until it was over his mouth. Helena's arm clamped around his head with the strength of rage contained for years. The morphine seeped into him as he struggled his fists weak against her body. His legs buckled, his eyes rolled back. Within moments, he sagged into her arms, his weight nearly dragging her to the ground. The alley swallowed every sound. With effort, Helena dragged him into the basement of a half-collapsed building, her breath ragged, her hands raw. She bound his wrists with Otto's rope, cinching the knots until his skin darkened. When Miller stirred, groaning, she was waiting. No mask now, no timid widow. Her eyes blazed in the candlelight, her lips a hard line. Do you remember Warsaw? She whispered in Polish. Muller blinked his drunken haze, thinning with fear. What are you saying? His German cracked as he recognized the language, recognized something worse than accident. You laughed, Helena said. Her voice did not shake. When children cried, when families burned, you laughed. He struggled against the rope, panic rising. You're mad. I was only a guard. I only followed orders. Her whisper cut sharper than any shout. Did you follow orders when you struck my brother? When you took bread from the starving? When you turned your back on mercy? Muller's mouth opened and closed, searching for lies, but the recognition in his eyes told her all she needed. Helena reached for the vial again, holding it before him so he could see. Tonight you will sleep, she said, but not in comfort. You will sleep knowing someone remembers. Muller shook his head, the rope creaking. No, please, I don't even know who you are. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, her voice a hiss. I am every name you forgot, every face you turned away from. I am the nurse who lived. And with that, she pressed the cloth, once more steady, merciless. His body convulsed and stilled, his eyes glazed. The silence that followed was not peace, it was judgment. When Helena left the ruins, the city's night swallowed her as if nothing had happened. Muller's body would be found days later, another drunk, lost to the shadows of Munich's wreckage. No one would question, no one would connect, but Helena knew. The first strike had been made, and the taste of it lingered like iron on her tongue. And as she walked back to her small room, the echoes of memory no longer felt like chains. They felt like fuel. The city did not notice the death of one man. Munich in 1948 had too many bodies, too many absences. People vanished into hunger, into rubble, into silence. A man like Muller could disappear and be dismissed as another casualty of post-war chaos. But Helena noticed the silence around his absence was louder than she expected. In the days after Muller's body was discovered, the tavern whispered. Patrons shook their heads, muttering about drunks who stumbled into bad luck, about thieves who preyed on easy marks. No one mentioned his past. No one spoke of Poland. No one dared to connect the lines Helena herself had traced. Still, her heart beat sharper every time she heard his name. She feared someone might look at her too long, might remember the widow with pale skin who drank beer without drinking. But no one did. She was invisible, the way survivors learn to be.
Yet invisibility did not mean safety. One evening, as she washed instruments at the clinic, Helena overheard two doctors whispering in the hallway. Another ex-soldier gone missing. One said, his voice low, cautious. They say it's nothing but... The rest was lost as they passed, but Helena felt her hands tremble. Another she had only struck once. That night, as she walked home under the thin yellow glow of street lamps, a different kind of fear curled in her chest. Someone else was hunting, or perhaps the city itself was beginning to choke on the shadows of the men who believed themselves untouchable. In her small rented room, Helena lit a candle and opened her notebook. She wrote Miller's name, then crossed it out with a single line. Beneath it, she listed the others she had watched, the ones she had followed with quiet steps. Vogel, Richter, Brown. She had planned to choose carefully, to move slowly. But if someone else was striking, if other whispers were true, then her path might grow tangled with another's. She could not allow that. This was her justice. The next weeks brought confirmation. At the market, she overheard women gossiping about a man who had not returned home from the bar. At the clinic, she heard a nurse whisper about the police finding another corpse near the train yard, throat cut clean. These were not her hands. These were not her tools. And yet they bore the same echo judgment. Helena's mind raced. Was it possible there were others like her, survivors, who had shed their silence, who hunted in the ruins of Germany the way wolves circled the weak? Or perhaps the city had birthed opportunists, men who killed not for justice, but for coin. Either way, the danger was clear. If the police began to see patterns, if they whispered of serial killers instead of accidents, suspicion could spread like rot. Her mask could crumble before she had finished her work.
One night, Helena dreamed she was back in the camp, the stench of smoke heavy in her lungs. She walked among shadows, faces, half-remembered voices, too faint to name. They turned toward her and whispered, but she could not hear the words. When she awoke, her pillow was damp with tears, her fists clenched. She understood the dream. The dead were not content with one name crossed out. They wanted more. Still, Helena could not ignore the other presence moving through Munich's streets. She began to listen more carefully. She traced rumors the way she once traced supply lines, as a nurse connecting fragments into a whole. Slowly, a figure began to form. A man who moved at night, a man who asked questions in Polish, who disappeared into the ruins after each body was found, a man who perhaps carried the same ghosts she did. But was he ally or rival? The whispers grew. In the tavern, Miller's old companions grew uneasy. Their laughter forced their drinks longer. One of them, Braun, spoke loudly about how men were being hunted. "Some rat out there thinks he's a judge," he spat, "but we'll smoke him out. We always do." Helena watched from across the room. Her eyes lowered, her ears sharp. Braun was on her list. His arrogance had not dimmed, his cruelty not erased, but now, with his voice loud, she knew time was running out. If Braun was aware, others would be too. The danger only heightened her resolve. She began to move more carefully, changing her routes, varying her hours. She abandoned the widow's mask, in some places wearing instead the quiet face of a nurse, too tired to notice the world. But at night, in the solitude of her room, she sharpened her plans. Braun would not be taken by surprise like Muller. She needed a new strike, one that would silence whispers instead of feeding them. And yet the whispers did not stop. They followed her like the echo of her own steps. Once leaving the clinic, she thought she heard someone trailing her, a faint crunch of gravel behind. She turned quickly, but the street was empty, only shadows. Another time, she returned to her room to find her notebook slightly out of place, the page with Muller's name bent at the corner. She froze, listening to the silence, her heart pounding. Had someone read it, or had she been careless? Every breath of the city seemed to carry secrets now. Every cough, every laugh, every slam of a door felt like a signal she could not read. Helena knew she was no longer alone in her mission, and the thought terrified and thrilled her all at once. One evening, as the wind rattled the window panes, Helena whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." The candlelight flickered, throwing her reflection against the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw someone else's face in the shadow beside hers, a man hard-eyed watching. She blinked and it was gone, but the whispers remained.
And they carried a warning. The darkness she had unleashed would not be hers alone. Munich winter of 1949. The snow fell thinly over the ruins, whitening the rubble but never softening it. The air was cold enough to freeze breath into clouds that hung like ghosts. For Helena, each step across the broken stones felt like a drumbeat towards something she could no longer ignore. The whispers had sharpened. No longer rumor, no longer vague gossip. They spoke of a shadow moving through the city, a figure who struck as she did. Helena had long wondered whether this phantom was ally rival or danger. Tonight she would find out. It began in the tavern as it so often did. Braun, loud and drunken, mocked the talk of vengeance sweeping through Munich. Fools, he sneered to his companions. If someone thinks they can hunt us, they'll find themselves gutted. We survive the camps, we survive the front. We'll survive some rat in the dark.
His words meant to provoke laughter, instead hung heavy in the smoke-thick air. Even his friends looked uneasy. Helena sat at a distance silent, her eyes lowered, but she heard every syllable. She marked Braun's arrogance, his dangerous awareness. He was not Muller, easy drunk unaware. Braun was alert, suspicious. To strike at him recklessly would be suicide, and yet she also knew that time was collapsing. Each day that passed without her hand moving, the whispers grew louder. She had to act. When Braun staggered out into the cold night, Helena followed, but something was different. She was not alone. She noticed it first in the rhythm of footsteps. Hers were measured soft. His were heavy, uneven, but there was another rhythm, faint, deliberate. She froze in the alley's shadow, her breath caught. The sound continued. Not Braun's, not hers. Someone else was following the same prey. Helena's heart raced. The second hunter. She slipped back into deeper shadow, then letting Braun stumble ahead. The other figure emerged faintly, a man tall, wrapped in a long coat, his hat low. He moved with a precision Helena recognized instantly, not the clumsy pursuit of a thief, but the measured stalking of someone who had done this before. Braun, oblivious, reached the edge of the ruins. He stopped to light a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his scarred face. In that instant, the man in the coat moved forward. Helena reacted before she could think. "Stop!" she hissed, stepping from the shadows. Both men froze, Braun in drunken confusion, the stranger in calculated surprise. The stranger turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the faint glow of streetlight. Helena saw them, cold, sharp, but not cruel, survivor's eyes. Braun blinked, laughter bubbling uncertainly. "What's this, a widow and a beggar, out for a walk?" He sneered, puffing smoke. "You people think you frighten me." Helena ignored him. Her gaze stayed on the stranger. "You've been hunting," she said softly, her voice in Polish. For a moment, the man's mask slipped. His eyes narrowed. Then he replied in the same tongue. "And you, nurse? You've been hunting too." Braun frowned, glancing between them. "What are you saying?" The silence that followed was thick, electric. The ruined street seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the three figures, predator, predator, prey. Then Braun's bravado faltered. He dropped his cigarette, stamping it out nervously. "You're mad, both of you. Stay away from me." He backed away, fumbling in his coat as though reaching for a weapon. The stranger moved first, lunging forward, but Helena was already there. She grabbed Braun's wrist, twisting sharply. His knife clattered to the stones. The stranger caught him from behind, pinning his arms. Together, they brought him down like wolves, pulling at the same carcass. Braun thrashed, cursing, spitting.
"You won't. You can't." Helena leaned close, her face inches from his. "Do you remember Warsaw? she whispered. His eyes widened, shock flickering through his drunken haze. He did remember. They all did. The stranger pressed a hand against Braun's mouth, silencing him. His other hand drew a blade, thin and sharp. Helena caught his wrist before it could fall. Their eyes locked. "This one is mine," she said, her voice low, steady. For a moment, neither moved. The wind howled through broken windows, snowflakes drifting between them. Then the stranger nodded a small, grim acknowledgement. He loosened his grip, leaving Braun gasping. Helena acted with precision. The morphine cloth pressed against Braun's face, his curses muffled into silence. His body convulsed, then slackened his breath, slowing until it was gone. When she lifted the cloth away, the stranger watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence afterward was heavier than the act itself.
Braun lay still, the snow beginning to settle on his body. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low. "You work with a healer's hand. Quiet, efficient." Helena straightened her cloak, wrapped tight. "And you with a soldier's?" He inclined his head. "Once." They stood in silence, two survivors, bound by blood, not their own. Helena felt a strange, unsettling calm. For months she had imagined she was alone, the only shadow moving through Munich with vengeance in her heart. Now she saw she was not. And though part of her wanted to recoil, another part felt less burdened. "What do you want?" she asked finally. The man looked down at Braun's lifeless body, then back at her. "What you want? Names erased, debts paid." He paused, his breath white in the cold. "But we cannot strike blindly. The city is watching now. If we are careless, we will both burn." Helena's eyes narrowed. "Then we do not strike blindly." For the first time, the faintest smile touched his lips. "Good, then we begin."
They left Braun in the snow, a nameless corpse, in a city already drowning in them. But for Helena, everything had changed. She was no longer a solitary shadow. She had met the other wolf in the ruins, and now their hunt would continue together or against each other. She did not yet know. But one thing was certain: the whispers in the dark had become a voice, and it would not be silenced. The night after Braun's death carried a silence so sharp that Helena felt it pressing against her skin. In Munich, bodies turned up often enough, but something about Braun's disappearance unsettled the circles that whispered. He had been loud, arrogant, certain of his untouchability. Now he was gone, erased like Muller before him. The message was spreading. Someone was watching. Someone was striking back. But Helena knew the danger. Fear was useful, but fear also forced men into corners, and cornered men struck back like animals.
She walked the empty streets, her boots crunching lightly against the frost, and thought of the man, the stranger whose name she did not yet know. He had watched her kill Braun with the calm of someone who had seen death too many times to count. He had not intervened, had not condemned her, but neither had he pledged himself to her cause. Their brief exchange replayed in her mind like an echo. "We cannot strike blindly. If we are careless, we will both burn." She found him again 3 nights later, not by chance, but by design. Helena had tracked him the way she once tracked wounds, in the infirmary, patiently, methodically. The ruins offered few places to hide. Survivors always returned to the same taverns, the same boarded-up apartments, the same alleys where the smoke was thick enough to choke memory. He sat at the far corner of a cafe, barely alive with light, a cup of black coffee before him. Untouched, the room was half empty, patrons hunched in coats, voices low.
His presence was like a weight. Even those who did not know him seemed to leave a respectful distance. Helena approached, sliding into the seat across from him without asking. His eyes lifted, gray, as steel calm as before. "You found me," he said softly. "I wasn't looking," Helena lied. He smiled faintly at her bluntness, though it never reached his eyes. "I don't believe you. But that is good. You are careful. She leaned forward, her voice low. If we are both hunting the same wolves, then we should not be in each other's way. His gaze lingered on her, searching, weighing. Do you believe in alliances? I believe in survival, Helena answered. A silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the clink of a spoon against a chipped cup. Then he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. My name is Victor. She nodded, but offered nothing in return. He smirked at her silence. Names are dangerous things. Keep yours if you wish. I do not need it to know what you are.
Helena's fingers curled against the table's edge. And what am I? Victor's eyes hardened, a wound that never healed. Like me. For the first time since meeting him, Helena felt something shift inside her chest. Not trust, but recognition. He understood without asking, without forcing her to recount the horrors she had stitched into silence. Why do you hunt them? She asked finally. His jaw tightened. Because they still breathe. It was an answer both too simple and too vast, but she understood. It was the same reason she did. The pact was unspoken at first. They began watching each other, trailing the same men through Munich's scarred streets. Sometimes Victor struck first, sometimes Helena did, and when one of them moved, the other covered the shadow. There was no ceremony, no vow, only the slow weaving of necessity into trust. But trust, Helena learned, was a fragile thing. One night they followed a man named Schreiber, a former officer who now sold black market cigarettes from a cellar near Sendlinger Tor. He had been seen often with Braun and Muller, and his name surfaced in whispers that bled with guilt. Schreiber was careful more so than the others. He never drank, never walked alone, and always checked his reflection in shop windows as though he could sense the ghosts breathing down his neck. Helena and Victor stalked him for days. Patience stretched thin. Then came the night when Schreiber slipped into an alley to relieve himself, his guards waiting at the corner. Helena tensed, ready to strike, but Victor's hand caught her arm. Not yet, he murmured. He is alone, she hissed. Not enough, Victor replied. His death must vanish, not ignite suspicion. Helena bristled the fury, rising hot in her chest. She had waited, watched, carried the weight of each face. To strike and end it seemed the only justice. Yet Victor pulled her back, forcing her into the shadows as Schreiber returned to his men oblivious. That night, in the silence of an abandoned warehouse where they hid Helena, confronted him. You stopped me, she said. You would have made a mistake, he replied evenly. A mistake? Her voice sharpened. You think I don't know how to do this? I think you are driven by anger, and anger blinds. Helena's hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. Do not speak to me of anger. You did not hold the hands of children as they bled in the camps. You did not watch men use scalpels like playthings. Do not tell me what blinds me. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. His shadow stretched long across the broken floorboards. Then he spoke softly, but with a weight that silenced her fury. I was in Odessa when they came, when they burned the synagogue with my mother inside. Helena froze her breath, catching.
They shot my father. Victor continued, his voice flat, as though scraping against the memory itself. They made me watch, so do not tell me I do not know anger. The silence between them was no longer anger, but something heavier, a kinship forged not of choice, but of shared ash. Finally, Helena lowered her eyes. Then why stop me? Because if you strike without care, they will know we are not ghosts, but flesh, and flesh can be hunted. The words cut her deeper than she expected. She hated that he was right. From then on, their pact grew stronger, not of love, not even of friendship, but of necessity, tempered by hard truth. Helena learned Victor's rhythms, his patience, his relentless calculation. He, in turn, adapted to her precision, her healer's eye that turned poison into silent death. Together they became a whisper, louder than rumor. Munich's nights trembled with their presence, even if no one could name them. Yet Helena could not shake the unease. Each time she looked into Victor's eyes, she saw a mirror of herself, scarred, relentless, dangerous, and in that mirror she feared what she might become. The pact of shadows was binding, but in the dark corners of her mind, Helena wondered, when the last name was erased, when the last debt was paid, what would become of her and Victor hunters without prey, wounds without closure. The question lingered like the smoke of Braun's last cigarette twisting through the ruins of Munich. And though Helena did not yet know the answer, she felt it tightening like a noose around both their necks. The first snow of that winter came quietly blanketing Munich in deceptive calm. The ruins looked softened, their jagged edges hidden beneath a pale veil, as though the city itself tried to forget the blackened scars beneath. But Helena and Victor knew that snow did not cleanse, it only concealed, waiting for the thaw to expose what still rotted underneath. They had waited weeks for this moment. The name on the list was Otto Reinhardt, once a surgeon at Dachau, a man whose hands had cut and stitched lives, not in healing, but in cruelty. Survivors spoke of him in broken whispers, how he treated prisoners like specimens, how he smirked when screams echoed through tiled walls. After the collapse, Reinhardt slipped easily into the shadows of post-war Munich, reinventing himself as a doctor of the people, providing cheap operations in secret, but his past was etched in scars too deep to erase. Tonight, Victor had said, as the snow began to fall, he will make his rounds. Helena adjusted the scarf around her face, the wool scratchy against her skin. They waited outside the building, where Reinhardt kept his private practice, a crumbling townhouse tucked between a bakery and a gutted library. The windows glowed faintly, casting fractured rectangles of light onto the snow. Inside, Reinhardt moved like a shadow, hunched and precise, his spectacles flashing in the lamplight.
Helena studied him through the frosted glass. He looked older now, softer, even his hair thin and white at the edges. To an outsider, he might have seemed harmless, a weary doctor still serving the broken city. But Helena's memory was sharper than the winter air. She remembered the testimonies, the trembling hands pointing at his photograph, the unflinching cruelty behind those same glasses. "Do you want it quick?" Victor asked quietly beside her. Helena's eyes narrowed. No, quick would be mercy. They waited until the patients left footsteps fading into the snowy night. Reinhardt was alone, wiping down his instruments with the same meticulous care he once applied to horrors. That was when Victor slipped inside his movements, as silent as the falling snow. Helena followed, closing the door behind them. The air inside smelled of alcohol and rust. Reinhardt did not notice at first, his back turned as he hummed faintly to himself. When he finally looked up, it was Helena. He saw first her figure framed against the flickering lamplight, eyes burning cold. He froze, his hand tightening around a scalpel. "Who are you, ghosts?" Helena said, her voice flat. Reinhardt's eyes darted to Victor, who stepped forward like a shadow given form. You're making a mistake." Reinhardt stammered his words, trembling though his hand did not. "I've done nothing wrong. I've saved lives here, children, families." Helena stepped closer, the crunch of glass beneath her boot, sharp in the silence. "And before that, what lives did you save?" Then Reinhardt's face, twisted anger flaring where fear had lingered. "War makes monsters of us all. Do you think your hands are clean?" The words struck sharper than the cold, but Helena did not falter. Her fingers reached into her coat, drawing out the vial she had prepared days ago. clear liquid glinting faintly in the light. Reinhardt's eyes widened. Poison. No, Helena whispered. Justice. She moved swiftly, years of practice guiding her hands. The vial emptied into his water glass on the desk, dissolving without a trace. She pushed it toward him. Drink. Reinhardt's breath quickened. His eyes darted between Helena and Viktor, desperate, calculating. You don't understand. I was ordered. We all were. If not me, another. I had no choice. Helena's voice cut like steel. Choice is a blade. You chose where to cut. You chose who to break. Silence pressed thick in the room. Reinhardt's hands trembled, but he lifted the glass. For a heartbeat, Helena thought he might refuse, might lash out with the scalpel instead, but then he drank the water sliding down his throat like shards of ice. The effect was slow, deliberate. His breath hitched his hands, clawed at his throat, the scalpel clattering to the floor. Helena watched without blinking, her face carved from stone. Viktor stood beside her arms, folded, his expression unreadable.
Reinhardt collapsed to his knees, gasping, choking. His glasses slipped from his face, shattering against the floorboards. His eyes locked on Helena's one last time, wide with disbelief, as though he could not fathom that the powerless had found their power again. Then he was still. Helena exhaled a shiver running through her chest. That was not from the cold. She expected satisfaction, triumph, the weight of justice delivered. Instead, she felt only emptiness, as though each death carved a hollow inside her that nothing could fill. Viktor's hand touched her shoulder, light but firm. One more ghost, silence. Helena turned her gaze to him. Do you ever feel it, the silence swallowing you after Viktor's eyes were distant? Always. They left Reinhardt's body on the floor, the snow outside swallowing their footsteps as they vanished into the night. Behind them, the lamplight flickered, once, then guttered out, leaving the house in darkness. By morning, word spread quickly through the city. Dr. Reinhardt was dead. Some said it was his age. Others whispered of sickness. But beneath the chatter, the survivors felt something else, a current of quiet relief, like the air was lighter if only for a moment. Yet Helena felt no relief, only the blood on the snow staining her hands, invisible. She feared she was not merely punishing monsters, but becoming one. And deep inside, a whisper grew stronger. This pact of shadows would not end clean. The snow did not melt quickly. It stayed for weeks, hardening into icy sheets that glistened under pale sunlight. Beneath its surface, Munich seemed frozen in time, as if the city itself held its breath. But whispers traveled faster than thaw, and the whispers this time were dangerous. Dr. Otto Reinhardt was dead. For the ordinary people of Munich, his passing meant little, another winter death. Another name crossed off the fragile list of survivors. But for those who knew his past, for the network of men who had hidden in plain sight, since the Reich crumbled, the death rang louder. It was not coincidence. It was not illness. Someone was hunting them. Helena felt the change immediately. Where once men like Braun and Vogel lounged in taverns, laughing too loud, now they moved cautiously. Their voices lowered, their eyes darted to shadows. The arrogance that once coated their every gesture had begun to crack, revealing fear underneath. Helena should have felt victorious watching them shrink into themselves. Instead, unease coiled inside her chest, because fear bred suspicion, and suspicion always sought a target. Within days of Reinhardt's death, the police announced an investigation, a task force they called it, dedicated to curbing the sudden rise of unexplained deaths among Munich's men. The newspapers, hungry for drama, called it Die Schattenmord, the Shadow Murders.
Journalists whispered of vigilantes, of underground justice, of ghosts that did not rest. And while no names were printed, Helena could feel the eyes of the city narrowing, searching for patterns in the smoke. One evening, Viktor brought news. He slipped into Helena's small apartment, shaking snow from his coat, his expression hard. "They're forming lists," he said without preamble. What kind of lists? Helena asked, though she already knew. Lists of former officers, former guards, men who fled the camps only to reappear as ordinary citizens. The police claim it's to protect them, but Victor's lips twisted. It looks like bait. They know someone is striking and they're herding the cattle together. Helena's stomach turned. It was clever, too clever. Gather the wolves' prey into one place, and eventually the wolves would show their teeth. "They're not entirely wrong," she murmured, staring at the flickering candle. "No," Viktor agreed. His eyes glinted in the dim light.
"But it means they're watching. And when they catch one of us," he did not finish. He didn't have to. That night, Helena lay awake long after Viktor had gone. The streets outside were quiet, muffled by snow, but in her mind, she heard boots marching doors, slamming names, shouted in the dark. She had lived this rhythm once before. Now the hunters had become the hunted. The net tightened, not only from the police, but from the men themselves. Braun, thick-shouldered and loud-mouthed, began to organize his old comrades. Helena watched from across the tavern as he gathered them around wooden tables, his fist pounding, his voice carrying over the smoke. "They think they can pick us off one by one," he growled. "No more. We fought a war, damn it. We know how to fight back." The men around him nodded, some with fear in their eyes, others with anger.
Helena recognized several faces she had marked in her notebook, each one a reminder of nights that still woke her screaming. Viktor, seated beside Helena in the shadows, leaned close. "They're circling like cornered dogs. Desperate dogs bite hardest." She didn't answer. Her fingers clenched around her glass, the cold of the beer pressing into her palm. Braun's arrogance had returned, not as laughter this time, but as fury. He would not go quietly into the snow. No weeks later, Helena received her first warning. She returned to her apartment after a late shift at the clinic, her steps echoing in the stairwell. The door stood ajar, her breath froze in her throat. Slowly, she pushed it open. The room was silent. The candle she had left on the table was gone. The air smelled faintly of tobacco smoke. And on her bed lay her notebook, open to a page she had not left exposed. The list of names stared up at her, the ink sharp and accusing. Across the bottom of the page, scrawled in a heavy, unfamiliar hand, were 3 words: "We are watching." Helena's knees nearly gave way. She closed the notebook with trembling fingers, her heart thundering. Whoever had been here had not stolen, had not harmed, had not even lingered. They had wanted her to know. The net was no longer closing. It had already closed. Viktor arrived within the hour, summoned by her panicked message. He scanned the room, his jaw tight, his fists clenching. "They know," Helena whispered, her voice raw. "They know it's me." "Not yet," Viktor said, though his tone betrayed no certainty. "If they knew, you'd already be gone." Helena shuddered. "Then what do they want?" Viktor's gaze fell to the notebook, then to her pale face. "They want to scare you, drive you into a mistake. They want you desperate, and if I already am." For the first time, Viktor's expression softened. He sat beside her, his voice low.
"Then you must remember, fear is a weapon. Wield it before they do." Days blurred into restless nights. Helena moved like a shadow through the city. Her every step measured her eyes, scanning alleys and rooftops. At the clinic, she smiled faintly for patience, but her mind raced with questions. Who had entered her room. Who had written the words? Was it Braun's men or the police task force or even Viktor himself testing her resolve? Trust had become a luxury. Even Viktor's loyalty flickered with doubt in the quietest hours, but the names in her notebook remained. The ghosts of the camp did not care for nets or threats or whispered warnings. They demanded justice, and justice would not wait. The breaking point came on a night thick with snow. Helena left the clinic late. Her footsteps muffled her breath, a pale cloud. The street was nearly empty, only the sound of wind rattling through shutters.
She turned a corner and froze. Three men waited in the alley shadows, breaking away from the wall. Braun stood at their center, his broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy coat, his eyes sharp and hungry. "Frau Keller," he said smoothly, his voice dripping false courtesy. Or should I say, ghost? Helena's heart hammered, but her face remained still. "I don't know what you mean." Braun smiled, stepping closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "Oh, I think you do." Behind him, the other men shifted hands, hidden in pockets, eyes darting. Helena knew the look, predators waiting for the signal to strike. The net had closed, and she was caught inside. Snowflakes swirled around the alley, spinning in the gusts like tiny knives of ice. The glow from a distant street lamp caught on Braun's face, highlighting the cruel twist of his smile. Helena stood rooted, her breath shallow, every nerve in her body screaming to flee. But she knew what that would mean. Weakness, prey. Braun advanced a step, his shadow stretching long across the white ground. "You thought you were clever?" he said, his voice low but carrying. "Reinhard Kruger Weiss. Gone, all of them. At first we thought it coincidence, but we learn, we watch." Helena's heart pounded. He was naming them, the very names she had written in her notebook. Every syllable fell like a hammer blow, proof that her secret was unraveling. "I'm just a nurse," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled inside her pockets. "You're mistaken." Braun's smile widened, but it was not warm. It was the grin of a wolf that had cornered a deer. "You survived too much to be just a nurse." He tilted his head, studying her. "Do you know how we survived the trials, the purges, the years after the war? We learned to sniff out threats before they tore us apart. And you, Fräulein Keller, smell of blood." The other men chuckled darkly. One shifted his coat to reveal a glint of metal at his waist. Helena's mind raced.
The streets were empty. No passerby would come. If she cried out, the wind would swallow her voice. She was trapped, unless her fingers brushed the small glass vial tucked deep in her pocket, a sedative meant for a patient that morning, but slipped into her coat by mistake, or perhaps fate. Braun took another step forward. "You'll come with us, quietly, or you won't walk at all." Helena forced herself to meet his gaze. "And if I don't," Braun's expression hardened, "then we do what we did best. That was enough." She moved. Her hand darted into her pocket, closing around the vial. In one swift motion, she hurled it to the cobblestones. Glass shattered, a puff of sharp chemical odor flooding the alley. The men flinched instinctively, coughing, waving their hands. Helena used the instant of confusion to slip sideways, darting toward the street. But Braun was faster than she anticipated. His heavy hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her back with brutal force.
She cried out as pain shot up her arm. "Not so fast," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Did you think you'd scare us with hospital tricks?" Helena struggled, her boots slipping in the snow. The other men recovered quickly, closing in, forming a ring. Braun's grip was iron. For a heartbeat, panic almost consumed her, and then from the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of motion, dark fabric shifting in the shadows. Viktor. He moved like a phantom, silent and sure, emerging from the alley's far end. In one hand gleamed a knife, long and narrow the blade, catching the dim light. His eyes were hard as stone, fixed on Braun. The men did not see him at first, too intent on their prey, but Braun sensed it, some animal instinct making him stiffen. His head jerked toward the movement. That brief distraction was all Helena needed. She drove her knee upward, catching Braun squarely in the stomach. His grip loosened with a grunt of pain, and she tore herself free, stumbling back. Just as Viktor struck, the alley erupted in chaos. Viktor's knife slashed the first man's arm, sending him howling into the snow. Helena grabbed a loose cobblestone and hurled it at another, catching his temple. Braun, roaring in fury, lunged for Viktor, his bulk like a battering ram. The two men collided, the knife flashing Braun's fists, swinging. Helena ducked, scrambled, her breath ragged. She needed to choose flee or fight, but as her eyes locked on Braun's massive form, pinning Viktor against the wall, her choice crystallized. Running was no longer enough. She grabbed a shard of glass from the shattered vial, its edges jagged. With a cry torn from deep within, she plunged it into Braun's side. The big man roared, his body jerking in shock. Blood blossomed dark across his coat, steaming in the winter air. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief as he turned to face her. "You," he gasped. Viktor did not waste the opening. His knife arced upward, catching Braun beneath the ribs. The sound was wet, final. Braun's body went slack, collapsing to the snow with a heavy thud. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breaths of Helena and Viktor. The other men, wounded and terrified, scrambled into the night, their footsteps fading fast. For a long moment, neither Helena nor Viktor moved. The snowflakes drifted lazily around them, settling on Braun's still form. Finally, Viktor spoke, his voice hoarse. "The trap wasn't for you," he said. "It was for them." Helena stared at him, her hand still clutching the bloody shard. "And if you hadn't come," Viktor's eyes met hers, unreadable, "then you'd be lying where he is." Her breath caught. She wanted to argue, to rail against his coldness, but the truth was there in the snow. Without him, she would be dead. She dropped the glass, watching it sink into white powder stained with crimson. The trap had been sprung.
But in the back of her mind, Helena knew the net had not loosened. If anything, it had drawn tighter. Braun's death would not end the hunt, it would escalate it, and Munich, already tense, would soon explode. The morning after Braun's body was found in the narrow alley, Munich awoke to unease that seeped like frost through every street. Snow still blanketed the cobblestones, but it was no longer pure. It was marred by boot prints, bloodstains scrubbed hurriedly by the night's snowfall, and whispers that traveled faster than the trams. By sunrise, police cordons stretched across half the quarter. Uniformed officers barked orders as journalists crowded at the edges, scribbling furiously. Curious citizens craned their necks, murmuring about murder in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might summon the killer. Helena sat in a cafe a block away, her hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee she could not taste. The newspaper headline already blared in bold letters: "Ex-Nazi officer found dead in alley, foul play suspected." Below the headline, Braun's name was printed, his past dragged into daylight. War crimes, trial evasions, political connections, all resurfacing now that his corpse lay in the snow. Helena's pulse raced as she read. The article framed Braun as both victim and villain, dangerous but also mysterious in his sudden end. Investigators, it said, believed he was targeted. No wallet, no robbery, too clean, too precise. She folded the paper, forcing her trembling fingers still. Every sentence was proof of what she already feared. Their secret war had reached the surface, and Munich, already fragile after years of post-war reconstruction, was about to fracture. Across the cafe, Victor sat calm as ever, his coat collar turned up, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He sipped his coffee without a flicker of concern, as though they were discussing weather instead of murder.
You look pale, he remarked quietly. They'll connect it to the others, Helena whispered, leaning close. They already suspect a pattern. Victor's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. Patterns make fear. Fear makes men desperate. That is good. Good, she hissed, her knuckles white against the table. Do you think this city can survive that kind of fear? Every corner will be crawling with police. Every step we take watched. Victor shrugged, unfazed. It was always inevitable. Braun's death was a crack. The others will see it and know the wall is collapsing. Helena looked away, staring through the frosted window. Outside, two officers spoke to a vendor, flashing their badges. Every passerby slowed, casting furtive glances. Children were hurried along by anxious mothers. The city itself felt like it was holding its breath. That night, sirens wailed more than once. Raids rattled apartment blocks. The police commissioner gave a statement on the radio, his voice firm, promising swift justice for Braun's death. Yet beneath his measured words, Helena heard the tremor of unease. He knew the city was on edge, and so did she. In her flat, Helena pulled the curtains tight and lit only a single lamp. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the scratch of her pen as she added to her notebook. Names, details, observations. Each mark felt heavier now, as if the ink itself was dangerous. When she closed the book, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The lines on her face seemed deeper. Her eyes, once soft, now carried a sharpness she barely recognized. Was this what vengeance turned people into? The knock at her door nearly sent her heart racing out of her chest. She froze, every muscle taut. 3 raps, firm but measured, not the frantic pounding of police, not the drunken slam of a neighbor. Victor, she let him in, her voice tight. You shouldn't be here.
The city is suffocating. If they see you, they won't. He cut her off, stepping inside his boots, leaving wet trails on the wooden floor. But you need to hear this. From his coat, he pulled a folded sheet of paper. She recognized the stationery at once. Police report, internal circulation. Where did you, she began. Does it matter? His eyes glinted. Read. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The report confirmed what she feared. Braun's death was officially linked to the recent mysterious incidents involving former officials. They were calling it systematic targeting. The police suspected an organized group, underground cells, resistance remnants. Her stomach knotted. They'll come for anyone who ever opposed them. That means sympathizers' innocence. Victor's voice was iron. It means they are afraid. And when men like them are afraid, they make mistakes. She slammed the report down. And if their mistakes kill more innocents than you ever avenge, the question hung heavy between them. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. Finally, Victor leaned closer, his tone softer but no less sharp. Tell me, Helena, do you mourn them? Braun, Reinhard, Krager? Do you think Munich mourns them? Her lips parted, but no words came. She thought of the victims she once treated in the camps, the children who never lived long enough to see freedom. No, she did not mourn men like Braun, but she mourned the city. She mourned the streets now filled with fear, the neighbors who avoided eye contact, the friends whispering behind locked doors. Munich was becoming a powder keg, and she was holding the match. The following days only deepened the tension. Police checkpoints multiplied. Anonymous tips flooded the stations, some true, most born of paranoia. Families whispered about informants. At night, searchlights swept across courtyards, shattering sleep.
One evening, as Helena returned from the hospital, she saw a child crying on the curb, his mother being dragged away by officers for questioning. The boy's wails echoed down the street, and Helena felt something crack inside her. She wanted justice. She wanted vengeance. But was this what it had to cost? When she confided in Victor later, his reply was as unyielding as stone. We cannot stop now. The tighter they grip, the sooner they break. But Helena wasn't certain anymore. The city wasn't just on edge, it was bleeding. And though she had started this path with clear purpose, now every step forward felt like treading on broken glass. As the week ended, the commissioner announced a curfew. Citizens muttered about martial law. Soldiers patrolled alongside police. Munich was a city in siege by its own fear, and Helena, sitting at her desk, with the notebook open, stared at the list of names she hadn't crossed out yet. Each name was another strike, each strike another fire in the streets. Her pen hovered above the page, trembling. For the first time, she wondered not whether she could finish her mission, but whether she should. Munich had never been so silent. Even in the harshest winters, the city had hummed with life tram bells, clattering markets, the laughter of children tumbling in the snow. But now, silence pressed against every window, every locked door. The curfew had drained the streets of their pulse, leaving only the distant echo of boots and the low growl of patrol trucks. Helena walked quickly down Sindlingerstrasse, her nurse's bag slung across her shoulder. The lamps burned faintly in the mist halos of weak yellow light. She kept her head down, her papers ready in case the patrol stopped her. Twice they did. Each time, young soldiers with nervous eyes scanned her identification with trembling hands. They looked barely older than boys. She saw fear in them, too. Fear of being attacked, fear of not catching the phantom that haunted the city. The murders had multiplied in rumor, if not in fact. Braun's death had birthed a storm of whispers. Others were missing. Others had been found dead in alleys, rivers, attics. No newspaper could confirm all of it, but the stories spread like plague. Munich no longer trusted itself. In the hospital, Helena noticed how patients spoke in hushed tones. Nurses avoided each other's eyes. A colleague, Marta, leaned close one morning and whispered, "They say it's the ghosts, the ones who never left Dachau." Helena forced a smile, though her chest ached. Ghosts, yes, perhaps that was what she had become. That night, Viktor visited her flat again. He carried no warmth of greeting, only urgency. "They've doubled the patrols," he said, shrugging off his coat. "But they are spread thin. Their net has holes." Helena closed the notebook on her desk, hiding the list.
And what of the people, she asked, the ones being dragged from their homes, questioned, terrified? You said fear would break the guilty. It is breaking everyone. Victor's eyes narrowed. This is war. Helena, did you think vengeance would be gentle? Her voice cracked. I thought vengeance would be just. For a moment, the air between them froze. He looked at her, unreadable, then turned to the window. Justice is a luxury. The dead do not wait for luxuries. She wanted to argue, but words failed. Instead, she stared at her trembling hands, remembering the child crying as his mother was taken away. Munich was sinking deeper into shadow. The next week, the streets became darker still. Posters appeared on walls, reward for information on the murderers. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. A knock at the door could mean police or worse accusation. Helena felt it at the hospital too.
Patients whispered about betrayal, about informants in every ward. Marta confessed that her brother had been arrested after a neighbor claimed he was seen near Bronze Street the night of the murder. He wasn't there, Marta said through tears. He was home with me. But who listens? Helena held her friend rage rising in her chest. This was the collateral she had never wanted, the innocent swallowed by the shadow she had helped cast. That evening, she went to meet Viktor in a safe house on the edge of the city. The room smelled of damp and smoke lit only by a single lantern. He spread maps across the table. Our next target is moving between Innsbruck and Munich, a courier one of the last, linking them to their hidden network. Cut him down, and we cripple what remains. Helena shook her head. No, not now. The city is unraveling. Another death will ignite panic. Viktor's jaw clenched. Panic is the lever that breaks tyrants. It's also the lever that breaks cities she shot back. For the first time, Viktor's calm cracked. He slammed his hand on the table, the lantern flickering. Do you think they will stop? Do you think these men, these butchers, will simply fade into history if we let them breathe? Every day they live is an insult to the graves we carry in our hearts. Helena's breath caught. His fury was righteous, but it terrified her. Was he fighting for justice, or was he consumed by vengeance, so absolute it could never be sated? She stepped back, whispering, and if we become butchers too? The question lingered like smoke. Neither spoke again that night. Outside Munich groaned under the weight of suspicion. Curfew arrests doubled. Murmurs of revolt circled among the poorer quarters. The commissioner's speeches grew harsher, his voice cracking under pressure. The city was a cauldron, and Helena felt the heat with every passing day. One night, unable to sleep, she opened her notebook. The list of names glared back at her. She traced them with her finger, each letter a wound. Some had already been crossed out: Braun, Reinhardt, Kruger. Others remained, but as she stared, the ink seemed to blur the names, twisting into the faces of her neighbors, her colleagues, Marta's brother. It struck her, then vengeance was not a blade that cut only one way. It was a fire, and fire did not care who it burned. She closed the notebook with a shudder. For the first time since this began, she wondered if the truest justice she could give was not another death, but an ending. The city of shadows stretched before her, fragile and trembling, and Helena knew one more step down this path, and Munich might never see the light again. But could she stop now, when the dead still whispered in her dreams? Munich was no longer simply a city of shadows. It was a labyrinth, twisting inward, trapping those who wandered too far. The alleys whispered with rumors, the walls seemed to lean in, and the silence of locked apartments carried more weight than words ever could. Helena felt the suffocation in her very bones. Each shift at the hospital drained her patience, terrified of speaking colleagues, whispering of informants, families torn apart by sudden arrests. The notebook on her desk weighed more than stone, and every name left uncrossed throbbed like an unhealed wound. Yet something else had begun to gnaw at her Viktor. He had grown different, not in the obvious ways. He was still calm, deliberate, still the man who appeared from shadows with a knife and vanished with the wind, but in subtler shifts. His silences grew longer. His eyes, once sharp with purpose, now flickered with something darker, hungrier, and then she noticed the lies. It began with an absence. One evening he promised to meet her at the safe house near Isartor. She waited for hours in the cold, the lantern sputtering low until dawn's light crept pale across the frosted window. He never came. The next day, whispers reached her in the hospital. Another man dead, this one not on her list. A baker known to have once supplied bread to the local commandant. His throat slit, his shop burned. Helena's blood turned cold. When Victor finally appeared 2 nights later, he carried no explanation, only a weary scowl and blood on his sleeve. She asked, her voice trembling, "Where were you?" He brushed past her, muttering, "Busy." She tried again. "The baker, was that you?" For the first time, he didn't meet her eyes. Her stomach twisted. That wasn't part of the plan. Victor's voice was ice. Plans change. He was complicit. They all were. Helena stepped back, her hands curling into fists. Complicit. He baked bread. Bread, Victor. That's his crime. He turned sharply, his face shadowed. "Do not pretend innocence. Every hand that fed them, clothed them, sheltered them, it is stained. You of all people should know that." The words cut her deeply. Yes, she remembered the camps, the empty bellies, the cruelty of those who looked away. But this was not justice. It was widening into slaughter. The cracks widened further a week later. Helena found a letter tucked under her door, written in hurried script. "He is not what you think. Watch him. No signature, no explanation, just those words." Her heart hammered. Was it from Marta, from a colleague at the hospital, or someone within Victor's circle itself? She realized with dawning horror that she didn't even know how many were in this so-called circle. Victor had never named them, never introduced her to anyone else. It was always shadows speaking to shadows. That night she followed him. It was reckless, dangerous, but she had to know. She trailed him through narrow streets, keeping to the darker sides, her nurse's scarf pulled tight. Victor moved with his usual precision, slipping past patrols, crossing frozen canals. Finally, he entered a warehouse at the city's edge. Helena crept to a crack in the boarded window and peered inside. What she saw hollowed her chest. Victor stood at a table surrounded by 3 men and 1 woman, all strangers to her. Maps and papers littered the wood, lit by a single hanging lamp. But it wasn't the maps that froze her. It was the faces. On the papers were photographs, grainy and stamped with official seals. Some she recognized, men from her list, but others were ordinary civilians, a schoolteacher, a shopkeeper, even Marta's brother. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath fogging the glass. Victor's voice carried, "We cannot wait for justice to crawl. Munich must bleed, and the city must remember the price of feeding monsters." One of the men nodded eagerly.
The woman leaned forward, her smile sharp. Helena staggered back, her pulse roaring in her ears. This wasn't her mission anymore. This wasn't the vengeance she had envisioned in the quiet of her flat. This was a purge, indiscriminate and ravenous. And Victor had crossed the line. The following day, Helena could barely function at the hospital. She dropped instruments, forgot simple instructions, her thoughts consumed by the image of Victor's circle, plotting murder in that warehouse. Marta noticed, laying a hand on her arm. "You're pale," Marta said softly. "Are you ill?" Helena forced a smile. "Just tired," but inside she was screaming. That night she sat alone in her flat, the notebook before her. She stared at the uncrossed names, then at the empty margins. Slowly she realized she had to make a new list, not of those who had wronged her people, not of those who had worn uniforms or barked orders, but of those who were corrupting justice into chaos. At the top of that new list, she wrote one name in a trembling hand: Victor. Her hand shook, her eyes blurred with tears. To write his name was to break the circle she had stepped into willingly. To write his name was to admit that her ally had become her enemy. But there was no other choice. She whispered to the empty room, her voice a promise. "If you've become what they were, then I will stop you too. Outside, Munich groaned in its restless sleep, unaware that the vengeance that had haunted it was now beginning to devour itself. The circle was broken. The storm outside rattled the shutters of Helena's flat as though the city itself sensed what she was about to do. The notebook lay open on the desk, a candle guttering beside it, casting long, quivering shadows across the page. The ink was still damp where she had written his name, Viktor. She stared at the letters until they blurred her throat tight.
Writing the name had been one thing, acting on it would be another. But she knew if she didn't move soon, Munich would drown in blood, and Viktor would be holding the knife. The next day, Helena forced herself into routine. She worked at the hospital, her hands steady as she bandaged wounds and measured doses. Yet behind every movement, her thoughts spiraled around one plan. She needed proof. If she was to stop him, she couldn't rely on whispers or her own trembling memory. She had to expose what Viktor was building. That night, instead of returning home, she retraced her steps to the warehouse. The snow had crusted thick over the cobblestones, muffling her footsteps. She kept her scarf high, her heart hammering in her ears. Through the same crack in the boarded window, she peered inside. This time, the table was more crowded, more faces she didn't recognize. The maps were marked with red pins, and in the center lay a list not unlike her own notebook, but longer, more indiscriminate. Entire neighborhoods were circled, schools, bakeries, apartment blocks. Viktor's voice cut through the low murmur. We strike at once on multiple fronts. The city will never recover. They will learn fear the way they once taught it. A younger man protested. But some of these people, they're not. Viktor slammed his fist against the table. Guilt is not individual. It is collective. Do you think the gas chambers would have functioned without the rail workers, without the neighbors who pointed the clerks, who stamped papers? Every cog kept the machine alive, and every cog must now break. The room fell silent. Helena pressed herself against the wall, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't retribution. This was war against the living, not justice for the dead. She slipped away before the meeting ended, her pulse wild.
She decided then she had to confront him. The following evening, she left a note at the safe house in Viktor's usual hiding spot. Midnight, the bridge, alone. The Isar River roared beneath the old stone bridge, black water churning with the thaw. Helena waited her breath, clouding in the icy air. She kept her nurse's coat tight, though it offered little warmth. Her fingers toyed with the small pistol she had hidden in her bag, an old heavy weapon given to her years ago by a patient who had survived the camps. She hated the weight of it, but tonight she needed more than resolve. Viktor arrived as always, sudden soundless. His coat was dusted with snow, his eyes sharp as he studied her. You wanted to meet, he asked. Yes. Her voice didn't waver, though her heart thrashed. I know what you're planning. He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. And you've gone too far. This isn't vengeance anymore. It's slaughter. You're turning Munich into another battlefield. Viktor's face hardened, the smile vanishing. And what would you have me do? Light candles, whisper prayers. You think justice is soft enough to be written in ink? He stepped closer, his boots crunching the snow. Justice is blood. You of all people should know that. Helena forced herself not to flinch. No, justice is choosing who deserves to answer, not tearing down everyone in your path. Viktor, you've become what we swore to destroy. For a moment, silence hung between them. Snow fell slow and soundless, veiling the world in white. Then Viktor laughed low and bitter. You still don't understand, Helena. I never swore to destroy them. I swore to finish what they started, only with the scales tipped. They believed in power through fear, and now fear will serve us. Her stomach twisted. Us. Who is us? Viktor. He didn't answer, but the gleam in his eyes told her enough. He was no longer fighting for the dead.
He was building something for the living, something terrible. Helena stepped back, her hands tightening around the pistol in her bag. Then I can't follow you anymore. Follow? He chuckled, but his tone was sharp. Helena, you've never been following. You've been leading me. Your list was the spine. Your fire was the spark. I only gave it teeth. The word struck her like a slap. He was right. Without her notebook, without her whispered names, perhaps none of this would have spiraled, but hearing him twist it made her resolve harden. No, she said, not anymore. Her hand closed on the pistol. She drew it, the barrel trembling, as she leveled it at his chest. Victor's eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to her. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer until the gun pressed against his coat. Do it, he murmured. End me, Helena. But know this, without me, the circle doesn't vanish. It closes around you. They already doubt you.
Do you really think you can stop what you helped begin? Her breath caught the letter, the whispers, the stolen glances at the hospital. Could it be true? Were the shadows already watching her, waiting? Do it. Viktor repeated, his voice a low growl, or you'll find the betrayal is yours, not mine. Her hand shook violently, the cold biting her fingers. She wanted to pull the trigger to end this madness before it spread further, but the weight of the decision crushed her. Then boots on snow. She turned her head just slightly enough to see figures emerging from both sides of the bridge, soldiers, police, and behind them familiar silhouettes from the warehouse, Victor's circle. It was a trap. Her chest constricted. Victor's gaze stayed locked on hers, calm, almost pitying. You see, he whispered, the circle is never broken, only tightened. Hands seized her arms. The pistol clattered to the ground. Voices shouted, some in uniform, some not.
She struggled, kicking, but there were too many. Victor stepped back, his figure framed by the falling snow. You could have stood beside me, Helena, he said softly, but you chose to betray. And in Munich, betrayal has only one end. Her scream was swallowed by the night as they dragged her from the bridge. The prison cell was damp and narrow, lit only by a thin slice of moonlight seeping through the barred window. Helena sat on the cot, her wrists raw from the rough rope that had bound them during the march through the snow. Every step since the bridge had been heavy with betrayal. The voices of the men, the grip of their hands, the cold steel of inevitability, it all pressed down on her chest like a crushing weight. The door creaked. Two men entered, shadows falling long across the stone floor. One carried a lantern, its glow dancing across Helena's face. The other lingered behind, silent but watchful. And then Viktor appeared.
He closed the door behind him with deliberate care, as though he were sealing a coffin. His coat was dry, his boots polished. He looked untouched by the chaos swirling in Munich. Helena forced herself to meet his eyes. So this is how it ends, she whispered, her throat hoarse. Viktor studied her for a long moment before setting the lantern on the floor. That depends, he said quietly. On you. Helena barked a bitter laugh. On me, you've already turned the city against me. Who would believe my word? Now his lips curved in that faint smile she had come to dread. That's the beauty of betrayal, Helena. It doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is that the doubt exists, and doubt, once planted, grows faster than truth. She leaned forward. anger flaring hot in her chest. You twisted everything. You took grief justice memory and you poisoned it. You made me complicit. Viktor crouched so they were level. His voice softened, almost intimate. No, Helena. I revealed what you already were. Don't forget it was you who wrote the names, you who whispered for reckoning. I simply carried your torch into the dark. Her stomach churned, but she refused to look away. I wanted justice, she spat. You wanted power. Victor's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. Power is justice. Without it, justice is only paper and ink. The silence between them thickened. Finally, Victor stood brushing invisible dust from his coat. Tomorrow you'll be moved. They'll decide what to do with you. Perhaps a quiet disappearance, perhaps an example for others, but tonight I wanted you to understand. He turned toward the door. Something inside Helena snapped. Coward, she hissed. He froze. Slowly, he glanced over his shoulder. You dress your cruelty in the clothes of justice, she said, her voice shaking, but growing louder. But deep down, you're still the frightened boy who watched and did nothing. You kill because you couldn't save. And no matter how much blood you spill, you'll never wash that truth away. For the first time, Victor's mask cracked. A flicker of something rage, grief, shame crossed his face before he hardened again. Without another word, he left the door slamming shut behind him. The hours stretched. Helena lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the faces of those she had once written in her notebook. Victims, survivors, names meant to honor, not condemn. Somewhere along the path, she had lost her way, and Viktor had seized it. When dawn finally broke, the guards returned. They dragged her through dim corridors until she emerged into a courtyard behind the prison. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling the boots of the men around her. A small crowd had gathered figures from Victor's circle. Some she recognized, others knew. Their breath smoked in the cold air. Viktor stood apart, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her.
No satisfaction, no cruelty, only the calm inevitability of a man closing a chapter. One of the guards announced in clipped tones, Helena Weiss, found guilty of treason against the circle, sentenced death. The words rang hollow in the frigid morning, swallowed by silence. Helena's heart pounded, but her eyes never left Viktor. You think killing me will silence the truth? She said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. But the truth has a way of surviving. It seeps into cracks. It whispers in ears. One day, Viktor, someone will remember what you really are. Viktor's jaw tightened. For a brief moment, she thought she saw doubt flash across his features, but then he nodded to the guard. The rifle was raised. Helena closed her eyes. She thought of the children she had nursed, the hands she had held, the whispers of the dying in the war's final days. She thought of her mother's lullabies, long forgotten, but suddenly alive. And she thought of the victims, the real victims, whose memories she had tried, however imperfectly, to honor. The crack of the shot split the cold morning. Her body crumpled into the snow, red blooming beneath her like a final terrible flower. For a long time, no one moved. Then Viktor stepped forward. He looked down at her still form, at the blood seeping into white. He reached into his coat and pulled out her notebook. The edges were worn, the ink smudged. He opened it to the first page, the names written in careful, deliberate strokes. He traced one with his finger. His expression was unreadable. Then with a sudden motion, he tore the page free. It fluttered to the ground, landing beside her body. The wind caught it, lifting it slightly before pinning it in the blood-soaked snow. Viktor turned away his circle, following in silence. The page lay there stark and fragile against the snow. Helena's handwriting etched in ink and blood, and though she was gone, her words remained waiting like seeds in winter for someone to find them. The archive room smelled of dust and iron, the scent of paper long forgotten. It was the spring of 1992, and Munich's city records were being relocated from a crumbling municipal basement to a newly built library. Box after box, yellow documents, frayed ledgers, brittle files was stacked in neat rows by weary clerks. Among them was Anna Fischer, a graduate student from Berlin, hired as a temporary assistant. She had little interest in clerical work, but her professor had urged her to take the job. History hides in overlooked corners, he had said. Sometimes the past chooses you. It was on the third afternoon, while cataloging a pile of miscellaneous materials, that Anna found it a thin leather-bound notebook wedged between two forgotten folders. Its cover was cracked, its pages swollen with age and damp. Across the front, faint but legible, was a name: Helena Weiss. Anna frowned. She had read about Weiss in passing. An enigmatic nurse whispered about in post-war police reports, a woman blamed for disappearances no one ever proved. In some circles, she was called the Angel of Shadows, a vigilante who avenged the crimes of the Reich. In others, she was a traitor, swallowed by her own thirst for blood. With trembling hands, Anna opened the notebook. The first pages were lists, names written carefully, sometimes accompanied by small notes: SS doctor responsible for Dachau experiments, commandant burned archives, collaborator betrayed families in Lyon. Some names were crossed out in heavy ink, others remained untouched. As she turned the pages, the lists gave way to fragments of thought, frustrated entries, sketches of faces, half-finished sentences. Justice delayed is justice denied. They walk freely while graves are still fresh. If no court will hear them, then I must. By the final pages, the handwriting grew erratic, desperate.
The neat script fractured into jagged strokes. The circle is poisoned. Viktor twists everything truth into shadow. If I fall, let the names remain. Anna sat frozen. The notebook trembled in her hands as if it carried its own pulse. That evening, she brought it to her professor, Dr. Kruger, an aging historian whose office was lined with books about the war. He adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the fragile pages, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you know what this is, Anna?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "It is evidence," he murmured, "but also a confession. Weiss was real, and she carried out some of these killings. That much aligns with scattered police notes. But here he tapped one of the final entries. This name, Viktor Adler. He has appeared in no official records. It seems he erased himself." Anna leaned closer. Then he was part of it, too. Kruger's eyes darkened. Or worse.
If her words are true, he turned her crusade into his own machinery. Perhaps many deaths attributed to her were his. Silence thickened the room. Outside, the evening bells tolled, echoing across Munich like old ghosts. Anna whispered, "So who was the monster?" Helena or Viktor Kruger closed the notebook carefully. History rarely offers simple answers, but what matters is this: the names. Those who escape judgment now have testimony against them, even if decades late. He handed the notebook back to her, his voice grave. "Guard it well. It is more than a relic. It is a reckoning." Weeks later, Anna stood in a small memorial hall in Dachau. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the shuffle of visitors and the occasional click of cameras. She carried the notebook in her satchel, its weight more real than any stone monument. In the quiet corner of the memorial wall, she knelt and pulled it out.
Slowly, she traced her fingers across Helena's handwriting, the ink of fury, grief, obsession. She imagined the nurse standing here decades earlier, watching the same gray sky, hearing the same silence that followed horror. Helena had been many things: healer, avenger, victim, executioner. But above all, she had been human, flawed, haunted, and desperate for justice in a world that had turned its back. Anna placed the notebook on the cold stone floor just for a moment, as though offering it to the dead. Your names are not forgotten, she whispered. When she rose, she felt the weight had shifted, not lighter, but shared, as though Helena's burden had passed into the hands of history itself. And somewhere in the long silence of memory, the past exhaled.
Epilogue, complete one shot the 50 words. Mai A. Ban seo mon min viet sim mod sa eo package title description. Hashtags thumbnail prompt. Cho epilogue. Ashes and ink. Je bien notan mod video. Get tuk tron finchoka series.